There are mornings that arrive without warning. No storm on the horizon. No obvious sign that the day will be different from the 1,000 days before it. Just the ordinary darkness before dawn, the familiar smell of cold concrete and motor oil, and the sound of a man breathing steadily in a place where he has spent more hours of his life than he can count. Walt Greer was 73 years old on the morning of January 8th, 1998, and he was standing in his garage in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, doing what he had done twice every year for the past 22 years. He was starting the truck. Not because he needed it, not because anyone had called, not because there was a job waiting or a road to drive or any practical reason that a man of his age and his circumstances would climb into the cab of a 1948 Autocar DC 100 at 5 o'clock in the morning in the dead of a Pennsylvania winter. He did it because the truck needed to be started, because engines that sit too long forget how to run, because some obligations don't expire just because the world has moved on and left them behind. The autocar coughed once the way it always did. Then it caught, and the engine settled into a sound that Walt had known since he was a young man, a deep mechanical rumble that seemed to come from somewhere below the ordinary range of hearing, something you felt in your sternum more than you heard with your ears. The exhaust rose in a pale column through the freezing air and disappeared into the darkness above the garage roof. Walt stood beside the truck with his hands in his jacket pockets and listened. He was a big man, or had been once. 42 years of mill work had built him broad through the shoulders and thick through the forearms. And though the years since retirement had softened some of that mass, you could still see the shape of what he had been. His hands were the most honest record of his life, wet and scarred, and permanently darkened in the creases from decades of steel dust and machine grease that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. His face was the face of a man who had spent most of his working life in loud places where you learn to communicate without speaking. Not unfriendly, just economy. Just the habit of a man who had learned that most things worth saying could be said with fewer words than people used, and most things that people said at length weren't worth saying at all. He listened to the engine for 4 minutes. Then he checked the oil, checked the coolant, walked around the truck slowly, the way a man walks around, something he is responsible for, touching the frame rails, checking the tires, looking at the custom boom that rose from the truck bed like a tower 24 feet of hand-welded I-beam, fabricated by his father's hands in this same garage nearly 50 years ago. He was still looking at the boom when the scanner on the workbench shelf crackled to life. Walt had kept a scanner in the garage for 15 years. He told himself it was habit, the same way he kept the radio on low when he worked. But the truth was something he didn't examine too closely. The truth was that he still listened for the kind of trouble that required the kind of equipment most people no longer owned. The voice on the scanner was a site supervisor, and what he was describing was happening 7 miles north of Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River. Walt stood very still and listened. A crane had gone into the river. A big 180 tons of machinery, 60-foot boom buried in the riverbed mud. It had been in the water for 4 days. A recovery company had been on site with a 200-ton hydraulic crane, the best equipment available, and they could not get close enough to the water because the ground along the bank was too soft from winter thaw and river seepage. The outriggers kept sinking. Every attempt to position the recovery crane failed. The insurance adjuster was coming Monday to declare it a total loss. 4 days, modern equipment, 200 tons of recovery capacity, and the crane was still in the river. Walt walked to the scanner and turned the volume up slightly. He heard the site supervisor's voice. A man named Theo Barnett, according to the exchange, described the situation with the particular flatness of a man who had already run out of hope and was now simply documenting his own defeat for whoever needed to hear it. Walt listened for another 3 minutes. Then he turned off the scanner, walked back to the autocar, climbed up into the cab, and sat with his hands on the steering wheel. Outside the garage windows, the darkness was beginning to thin. Somewhere to the east, behind the hills that rolled across western Pennsylvania like the shoulders of sleeping giants, the sun was preparing to rise on a morning that would be the same as every other morning for almost everyone in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Walt sat with his hands on the wheel and thought about the ground along the Allegheny River north of Pittsburgh. He had worked that stretch of riverbank in 1967 when a barge had broken loose in a winter storm and 2 pieces of equipment had ended up in the water. He remembered the way the ground behaved up there, the particular quality of the soil near the bank, where it looked stable but wasn't, and where further back the earth remembered being solid in a way the surface did not show. He thought about his father. He thought about what his father had built. Then he put the truck in gear and drove north. To understand what happened on the Allegheny River that January morning, you have to understand who Walt Greer was. Not just the surface of him, not just the age and the size and the quiet manner, but the whole shape of the life that had made him the particular kind of man who drove north on a January morning without being asked and without any certainty that he could do what he was going there to try. Walt Greer was born in 1925 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the second son of Henry and Ruth Greer. Henry Greer had come to Pennsylvania from the coal fields of West Virginia in 1919, following the work north the way working men followed work in that era, not with optimism exactly, but with the steady practical understanding that a man's body was the primary capital he possessed, and that capital needed to be deployed where it was valued. Henry found work at the steel mill in Johnstown and spent the next 30 years there learning the particular intelligence that mill work requires. Not book intelligence, not the kind that can be tested or credentialed, but the intelligence of load and leverage and material, the intelligence of understanding how heavy things want to move and how to cooperate with that want rather than oppose it. Henry was the kind of man who built things, not as a hobby, not for recognition. He built things because he saw problems that needed solving, and he had the skills and the patience to solve them. In 1948, Henry Greer bought a surplus Autocar DC 100 chassis from an Army disposal yard for $800 money he had saved over 3 years by taking extra shifts and doing small welding jobs on weekends. The chassis was a bare frame, nothing else. Just the engine, the transmission, and the frame rails. Over the next 2 years, Henry built a wrecker on that chassis in the garage behind his house on Maple Street in Johnstown. This was not a small undertaking. Henry fabricated the boom himself from I-beams he sourced from the mill's steel that would have otherwise been scrapped, salvaged with permission, and hauled home in the bed of a borrowed pickup truck. He designed the boom as a fixed vertical tower 24 feet tall, rather than the articulated hydraulic designs that commercial manufacturers were beginning to favor. His reasoning was simple and structural. A fixed tower built from I-beam was stronger than a jointed boom under the same load and height, created leverage that proximity could not. The winch was mechanical, a massive drum driven through the truck's transmission by a gear reduction that Henry calculated by hand on paper he saved from the mill supply room. The reduction was extreme by any commercial standard. The cable moved at walking pace, but the force at the drum was something that a man with a slide rule and an understanding of gear ratios could produce on paper, and that the steel proved out in practice. Henry built the winch housing from plate steel he cut and welded in the garage. He ran the cable through a series of snatch block positions he had designed based on the recovery scenarios he anticipated. He tested the whole system by pulling a loaded coal truck out of a ditch on Scalp Avenue in the winter of 1950, and when the truck came out clean and the autocar didn't move an inch, Henry put his tools away and declared the project finished. He ran a small recovery operation alongside his mill work from 1950 until his death in 1976, mostly helping other steelworkers and factory men whose vehicles had gotten into trouble on the river roads and mountain grades around Johnstown. He charged what people could pay, which was often not much and sometimes nothing at all. He did it because the truck was built to do it, and because his particular understanding of value held that a thing well made for a purpose ought to be used for that purpose. Walt grew up watching his father work. He learned to drive the autocar when he was 16, sitting in the cab beside Henry and listening to explanations that were more demonstration than instruction. His father's hands moving through the motions of a recovery operation, while the words came in short functional bursts. Don't fight the weight. Talk to it. Find where the ground remembers being solid. Listen to the cable. The cable will tell you when you're asking too much before the numbers do. Walt went to work at Bethlehem Steel in Johnstown in 1953, right out of high school, and spent the next 39 years learning the deeper grammar of the same language his father had taught him, the language of steel and load and mechanical advantage, the language of moving heavy things in hard conditions with the tools available, rather than the tools you wished you had. He married Eleanor Marsh in 1956. They had one child, a son named Marcus, born in 1961. Eleanor was a quiet woman with strong opinions and the particular patience that is required to be married to a man whose primary relationship is with his work. She understood Walt in the way that people who love difficult things develop understanding not by simplifying him, but by learning the specific shape of his complexity and accommodating it without complaint. Marcus grew up in the same house where Walt had grown up on the same street in Johnstown, but in a different world than the one his grandfather Henry had inhabited, or that his father Walt was inhabiting. Marcus was good with numbers and better with computers, and by the time he was in high school, it was already clear that his intelligence ran in directions that had nothing to do with steel or equipment or the mechanics of moving heavy things. This was not a source of conflict between father and son. Conflict requires a collision, and their trajectories diverged too completely for collision. They simply did not occupy the same conceptual territory, and as Marcus grew older and moved further into the world of software and systems and abstraction, the distance between them became geographic as well as intellectual. Marcus went to Carnegie Mellon, graduated in 1983, and took a job in Seattle that he still held in 1998. He was a good son in the ways that were available to him. He called regularly. He sent money when Walt had medical expenses. He came home for Christmas in the years when flights were affordable. But he did not understand the truck. He had never understood the truck. The last time the subject had come up directly between them, Marcus had said with the patient reasonableness of a man who believed he was being helpful, "Dad, that truck is just rust and memories. You should let someone who can actually use it take it off your hands." Walt had not called Marcus back after that conversation. Bethlehem Steel's Johnstown facility closed in 1992. Walt was 67 years old. He had planned to work until 70, and the closure took that plan away from him without consultation or recourse, the way closures do with a letter, a date, and a severance package that acknowledged 39 years of work with the particular impersonality of institutional mathematics. Walt retired. Eleanor died of cancer 14 months later in the spring of 1993. Walt cleaned out the house methodically, kept what mattered, donated the rest, and began the process of learning how to live in rooms that had stopped being shared. He kept the truck, he kept the tools, he kept the scanner. And twice a year in May and in January, he drove the Autocar out of the garage, warmed the engine, walked around the frame, checked the cable, tested the winch, and then drove it back inside and covered it with a canvas tarp that he had owned since 1974. No one in Johnstown thought much about this. Men of Walt's generation and background kept things that other people would have discarded. They maintained them with the same regularity and the same unstated conviction that a thing worth keeping was worth keeping properly, and that the moment you stopped maintaining something was the moment you admitted you had given up on it. Walt had not given up on the truck. He had simply been waiting in the way that he had learned from Henry for the situation that required it. The construction site on the Allegheny River was 7 miles north of Pittsburgh on a stretch of riverbank that Walt recognized as he approached it, not because he had been there recently, but because the topography of the western Pennsylvania river valleys is consistent in its character, and a man who has spent time along those rivers develops a reading of the land that persists long after the specific memories have faded. He drove the Autocar at 25 miles per hour, which was approximately its comfortable cruising speed, on a clear road, and the drive from Johnstown took longer than it would have taken in a modern vehicle. Walt did not mind this. He had spent 42 years working at speeds determined by the pace of molten steel and the turning of enormous machines, and he had learned that hurrying toward a complex situation generally made the situation more complex. The construction site came into view shortly after 6:30 in the morning. Walt could see the recovery crane before he reached the gate, a massive yellow hydraulic unit sitting well back from the riverbank, its boom lowered, obviously not working. Beyond it, further toward the water, he could see the construction crew standing in a loose cluster, and beyond them in the gray January light, the counterweight of the submerged crane breaking the surface of the Allegheny like the back of something that had drowned. Walt pulled up to the construction gate and stopped. The gate was managed by a young man in a hard hat who looked at the Autocar with the expression that people often wore when they saw it for the first time, a compound expression that mixed surprise with something approaching amusement, the involuntary response to seeing something so dramatically inconsistent with its surroundings. Walt rolled down the window. "I need to speak with whoever's running this site." The young man at the gate took a moment to collect himself. "Sir, this is an active recovery operation." We're not. The recover's operation hasn't worked in 4 days, Walt said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I'd like to speak with the site supervisor. There was a pause. The young man spoke into his radio. There was another pause longer. Then Theo Barnett appeared from the direction of the construction trailers, walking fast in the way of a man who has been operating in crisis mode for 4 days and has developed crisis mode as his default gait. Theo Barnett was 44 years old, which Walt could see from the way he carried himself, young enough to still believe that effort and competence ought to be sufficient, old enough to know that sometimes they weren't. He was a solid-looking man with the kind of face that suggested he had been handsome in a conventional way before the job had finished with the conventional parts. He looked at the autocar, looked at Walt, and his expression managed to contain several things simultaneously: exhaustion, skepticism, and the very thin possibility of hope that a man feels when he has run out of alternatives. "You the guy who called?" Theo asked. "I didn't call," Walt said, climbing down from the cab. "I drove." Theo absorbed this. "What can you do with that?" He gestured at the autocar, at the boom, at the whole improbable machinery of it. "Let me look at the ground first," Walt said. "Then I'll tell you what I can do." The construction crew had noticed the autocar by now. Work had effectively stopped. There was no work being done anyway, hadn't been for 4 days, and the men had gathered in the informal, drifting way that people gather when something unexpected provides a break from the monotony of waiting. Walt heard comments as he walked past. A few of them were funny, and none of them were kind. He had heard the same comments in various forms for most of his working life. People who had never built anything with their hands found it easy to mock the things that other hands had built. Walt did not stop walking. Lester Vance, the lead engineer from the recovery company, fell into step beside him before Walt had gone 20 feet past the gate. Vance was 38 years old and held degrees from 2 universities and had spent 15 years in heavy recovery operations across 12 states. He was not a stupid man. He was in fact a genuinely intelligent man who had developed his intelligence in the particular direction that formal education and professional certification had pointed it, which was the direction of calculation and specification and the management of known variables. He looked at Walt with the professional courtesy that intelligent men sometimes deploy as a substitute for genuine respect. "Sir, I understand you think you might be able to help here," Vance said. "I want to be straightforward with you. We've assessed this situation thoroughly. The crane weighs 80 tons. The boom is buried 4 feet in river mud. The current is running at 4 knots. The bank is completely saturated. We've been unable to position our recovery crane safely, and our unit has 200 tons of rated capacity. What you have," he paused, looking at the autocar with an expression that suggested he was trying to be generous. "What you have there isn't rated for what this job requires." "I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm telling you what the physics say." Walt stopped walking. He looked at Vance. Then he looked at the river, at the submerged crane's counterweight, above the dark water, at the gray sky above the gray river on a gray January morning in Pennsylvania. "You're trying to lift it," Walt said. "We're trying to recover it, yes." "That's the problem," Walt said, and kept walking. Vance stopped. He stood for a moment in the cold air, and then he followed. Walt walked the riverbank for 25 minutes. He did not look at the submerged crane. He looked at the ground, the way it compressed under his boots, the color of it, where it was wet, the way the surface vegetation told a story about what was happening 2 and 3 feet below the surface. He carried a steel rod about 18 inches long, and at intervals he pushed it into the earth and noted the resistance and the depth of penetration. Vance walked beside him and said nothing after the first 5 minutes. There was something in the quality of Walt's attention that made speech feel like interference. Walt moved along the bank closer to the water and then further back, reading the ground the way his father had taught him to read it, not as a surface but as a record, a geological document that told you what the earth had been doing long before you arrived and what it was likely to do next. He found the soft zones quickly, the places where the frost hadn't penetrated and the river seepage had undermined the apparent stability. He found the places where the recovery crane's outriggers had sunk. You could see the depressions still even after 4 days. And then 85 feet from the water's edge, on a slight rise where the ground had a different quality, firmer, more compressed, with a different sound, under his boot, Walt stopped. He pushed the rod in. It went 6 inches and stopped. He pushed harder. 8 inches. Solid. He walked 10 feet along the rise, pushed again. The same. He walked back and forward, mapping the extent of the solid ground, and it was enough. It was exactly enough. He turned and looked at the submerged crane, calculating the angle from where he stood to where the crane sat in the water, factoring in the height of the autocar's boom, the reach of the cable through the snatch block positions his father had designed. He did the geometry the way his father had taught him, not with instruments, but with the spatial intelligence that comes from years of moving heavy things and understanding how forces work through cables and pulleys and the relationship between height and angle. It would work. The physics would work. Not the way Vance's physics worked, not by brute force and rated capacity, but the way his father's physics worked by cooperation, by finding the line along which the load wanted to move and applying force in that direction rather than against it. He walked back to where Theo Barnett was standing watching him. "The ground is stable 85 feet from the bank," Walt said. "There's a rise. You can feel where the frost's gone all the way through. It's solid at 8 inches. If I position the truck there, I've got enough boom height to pull from a useful angle. Your crane is too heavy for the stable ground and too short for the distance. Mine is light enough to sit on solid earth and tall enough to make the angle work." Theo looked at him. "You're saying you can pull it from 85 feet. I'm saying I can start it moving. Once the boom clears the mud and the weight shifts forward, the river helps instead of fights. Your crane is trying to overpower the situation. I'm trying to cooperate with it." Theo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the crane in the river, at the recovery equipment sitting idle at the autocar with its homemade boom and its 50-year-old winch. He looked at Vance. Vance spread his hands slightly, not objecting, not agreeing, the gesture of a man who had run out of better options and knew it. Theo looked back at Walt. "Show me what you need," Theo said. Walt nodded once. He turned toward the autocar. The morning light was coming in low and cold over the eastern hills, and the river was dark and moving steadily, carrying the winter downstream toward wherever winter went. The crew watched him walk back to the truck. Some of them were still talking among themselves, still carrying the amusement of men who had found something they could be certain about in a situation where certainty had otherwise been hard to come by. Walt heard Lester Vance behind him, speaking to Theo in a low voice, making one more technical case for impossibility. Walt climbed into the autocar's cab. The engine was still running. He had left it running because old engines in cold weather were better kept warm. The rumble was steady and deep, the same rumble he had known since before he could drive the sound his father's work made when it was alive and ready. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and thought about Henry, not with sentiment. Walt was not a sentimental man or did not think of himself as one. He thought about Henry the way you think about a teacher when you are about to attempt something the teacher prepared you for. He thought about the boom, about the wells his father had laid down in this same garage 48 years ago, about the calculations his father had done on paper from the mill supply room, about the principle Henry had articulated so many times that Walt could no longer remember the first time he had heard it. "Don't fight the weight, talk to it." Walt put the autocar in gear and began to position it. The recovery crew watched. Theo Barnett watched. Lester Vance watched. The January morning held its cold breath, and the Allegheny River moved steadily past, dark and purposeful, carrying everything toward where it needed to go. Walt drove slowly, carefully, reading the ground through the truck's frame, the way his father had taught him to read it, feeling for the change in resistance, the shift in the Earth's message from soft to solid. When he felt what he was looking for, he stopped. 85 feet from the water, on solid ground. He set the brake. He sat in the cab for a moment looking at the river. He thought about Eleanor. He thought briefly and without resolution about Marcus and the phone call he had not returned. He thought about the 42 years at Bethlehem Steel and the winter mornings he had driven to the mill in the dark before sunrise, and what it had meant to spend a life doing work that mattered in ways that could not be easily explained to people who had not done it. Then he climbed down from the pond, walked to the back of the truck, and began to rig. The rigging of a recovery operation is not a dramatic thing to watch. There is no single moment of spectacle, no gesture that communicates its own significance to an observer who doesn't understand what they are seeing. It is instead a sequence of deliberate, unhurried actions that build on each other the way a careful argument builds each step, creating the conditions for the next, each decision informed by the decisions that preceded it. Walt worked alone. Theo Barnett had offered men. Three of them young and willing, standing ready at the edge of the autocar's operational zone with the particular eagerness of people who want to be useful and haven't yet been told how. Walt had looked at them briefly, then at Theo, and said, if something goes wrong out there, it goes wrong with me, not with your crew. Theo had started to object, and Walt had simply begun working, which ended the conversation more effectively than any argument would have. The construction crew watched from a distance that was respectful in some cases and dismissive in others. A few of the younger men had stopped making comments. Something in the quality of Walt's movement had altered the emotional atmosphere around the truck, the way a change in barometric pressure alters a room before a storm. They couldn't have said what exactly had shifted. Walt hadn't done anything impressive yet. He had simply worked with the focused, unhurried precision of a man who had done this specific kind of work many times and had never found a reason to rush it. Lester Vance stood apart from the crew closer than the others, watching with an expression that had evolved over the past 20 minutes from professional skepticism into something more complicated. He was holding a clipboard he wasn't writing on. His eyes moved between Walt's hands and the cable and the snatch block positions with the involuntary attention of an engineer observing a methodology he hadn't encountered before. Walt ran his primary cable from the autocar's winch drum through a heavy-duty snatch block he anchored to one of the concrete jersey barriers that the road crew had positioned along the site perimeter. The snatch block doubled his mechanical advantage. The force at the winch drum multiplied through the block's geometry in a way that transformed slow mechanical movement into extraordinary pulling power. He positioned a second block at a different angle, creating a compound system that Henry had designed not from textbook principles, but from the practical experience of actual recovery, work on actual riverbanks with actual equipment that didn't cooperate. The cable ran from the winch drum to the first block, back to a secondary anchor forward to the second block, and then down toward the river in a line that would need to be connected to the submerged crane's frame at a point Walt had already calculated from the bank. The angle mattered enormously. Too shallow and the pull would drag the crane across the riverbed rather than breaking the suction. Too steep and the cable would lift rather than shift, and lifting 80 tons with this equipment was not the objective. The objective was to move it, to coax it, to find the line along which it would agree to travel. Vance had been watching the block configuration for several minutes when he walked closer. Not aggressively, just near enough to see the detail of the rigging. That's a compound pulley system, he said, not to challenge, just to confirm what he was seeing. Yes, Walt said without stopping what he was doing. You're running it through two fixed points to change the force vector. Yes. Vance was quiet for the moment. I've seen that in historical documentation. 19th century industrial recovery operations, before hydraulics made it obsolete. Walt looked up at him, then briefly. Hydraulics didn't make it obsolete. It made it unnecessary for most jobs. This isn't most jobs. Vance had no answer for that. He stepped back and let Walt work. The rigging took 90 minutes. By the time Walt had the cable system configured and tested, he tested it by applying partial winch tension and watching how the block seated, making two small adjustments to the anchor positions. Before he was satisfied, the morning had moved past 8 o'clock, and the January sun had climbed to its low winter angle above the Pennsylvania hills, throwing flat, cold light across the construction site and the river beyond it. Walt stood at the back of the autocar and looked at the river. From where he stood on the solid ground of the rise with the cable running down toward the water, at the angle he had calculated, he could see the submerged crane's counterweight clearly, and below it, just visible in the murky January water, the upper section of the boom. The current moved steadily past the exposed metal, dark and cold, and entirely indifferent to the situation it had helped create. He picked up his chest waders from the truck bed, sat on the running board, and pulled them on. The waders were old, not as old as the truck, but old enough. Heavy rubber construction, reinforced at the knees and thighs, built for the kind of water work that modern neoprene waders had largely replaced. Walt had bought them in 1971, and they had outlasted 3 pairs of the newer style he had tried in subsequent years, each of which had failed in ways the old rubber had not. Theo appeared beside him while he was adjusting the wader straps. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the river, at the waders, at the cable lying along the ground toward the water. "You're going in alone," Theo said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. Walt, the water temperature is 34 degrees. The current is, I know what the current is, Walt said. I've been reading that river since before you were born. He said it without sharpness, just as information. Theo was quiet, then, how long have you done this kind of work? Walt thought about it for a moment. Since I was 16, he said. My father taught me. Theo looked at the autocar at the boom rising against the January sky. That's his truck. It was. Now it's mine. Theo nodded slowly. There was something in his face that had not been there an hour ago. Not quite respect, not yet, but the precondition for it. The recognition that the man standing in front of him had a kind of knowledge that couldn't be credentialed or demonstrated in advance, only observed in operation. I'll have men at the bank, Theo said, in case. Walt looked at him. That's your call to make, he said, which was not agreement and not refusal. Just acknowledgement that Theo had authority over his own crew, and that authority was not Walt's to override. Walt coiled the end of the cable over his shoulder, stood up from the running board, and walked toward the river. The construction crew went very quiet. The Allegheny River in January is a thing of serious and impersonal beauty. The water runs gray-green in the winter light, cold enough to be dangerous within minutes of immersion, moving with the quiet but absolute authority of something that has been doing what it does for longer than any human concern has existed. The banks are gray mud and gray stone and the occasional bare root system of a riverside tree, and the whole scene has the quality of a landscape that has temporarily suspended its interest in the people standing at its edge. Walden rehearsed the water at the point where the bank offered the firmest footing, stepping carefully on the submerged stones that he had identified from the bank during his earlier survey. The cold hit him immediately, even through the waders, even through the heavy wool socks he wore inside them. The cold was a physical presence, a pressure that had weight and intention. The current pushed at his thighs, steady and insistent, trying to redirect him downstream. He did not fight the current. He angled into it slightly, using its pressure as a counterbalance, moving at a diagonal that brought him toward the submerged crane without opposing the river directly. This was also something Henry had taught him, or rather something he had observed Henry do so many times, that the instruction had been absorbed without being explicitly spoken. The river is not your enemy. Work with it. Find the angle it's willing to offer. The water deepened as he moved toward the crane. By the time he was 20 feet from the bank, it was at his waist. By 30 feet, it was at his chest, and the current was stronger here, in the deeper channel where the water had more volume and less friction to slow it. The cable over his shoulder had weight and drag of its own, the wet steel pulling backward toward the bank, while the current pulled sideways. And Walt moved through these competing forces with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned that balance in difficult conditions is less about strength than about attention. He could see the crane's frame clearly now, just below the surface. The boom descended at an angle into the deeper mud of the riverbed, and the frame itself was tilted counterweight, holding the rear portion near the surface while the front end was pulled down by the weight and suction of the submerged boom. The crane had been in the river for 4 days, and in 4 days the Allegheny mud had done what Allegheny mud does, settled around the intruding metal with the patient, thorough grip of something that does not distinguish between equipment and geology. Walt reached the crane's frame and stopped. He stood in chest-deep water, the current pushing against him, the cold working its way through the rubber of the waders, and he looked at the crane's frame with the same quality of attention he had applied to the ground on the bank. Not looking for what he expected to see, looking for what was actually there. What was actually there was not what anyone on the bank expected. There was a piece of steel, old steel, not construction, project steel, not anything that belonged to the crane or the current project. It was a section of structural I-beam, corroded and river-darkened, clearly of considerable age, wedged between the crane's frame and the riverbed at an angle that had locked the frame in position as effectively as a deliberate anchor. It was, Walt understood immediately, a remnant of something older, a bridge pier, a retaining structure, some piece of infrastructure from a previous era that had ended up in the river and been covered by silt over the years, invisible to any survey that didn't involve a man standing in the water looking at it directly. He understood, standing in 34-degree water, with the current pushing against his chest, what this meant. It meant that every calculation the recovery team had made about the crane's position and the force required to move it was wrong. Not wrong because the engineers were incompetent. They were not incompetent. Wrong because they were working from incomplete information from a model of the situation that didn't include this piece of old steel that was invisible from the surface and unreported by the divers who had assessed the situation 4 days ago. Either they hadn't gone deep enough to see it, or they had seen it and not understood its significance, or the silt had shifted in the days since and covered something that had briefly been visible. If the recovery crane, the 200-ton hydraulic unit, sitting useless on solid ground 100 yards away, had managed to apply its rated force to the cable in the direction they had planned, it would not have pulled the crane out of the river. It would have rotated it. The old I-beam would have acted as a pivot point, swinging the crane's counterweight down and the boom up, and the whole 80 tons would have rolled deeper into the channel before anyone understood what was happening. Walt stood in the cold water and looked at the situation and thought. The thinking took 4 minutes. He knew it took 4 minutes because he had developed the habit in millwork of tracking elapsed time in cold or dangerous conditions without a watch, not precisely but accurately enough to know when the body's tolerance was approaching its limit. The solution was available. It required changing the cable attachment point from the location he had planned on the bank to a different point on the crane's frame, one that would apply force in a direction that drew the crane away from the old I-beam rather than against it, and that would, as the crane began to move, and allow the I-beam to slide out of its locked position rather than continuing to act as a pivot. The new attachment point was lower on the frame and further toward the crane's cab. Reaching it required Walt to go partially underwater in a river moving at 4 knots in January. He went. He did not think about the temperature. Thinking about temperature in cold water is a way of making yourself feel the temperature more completely, and Walt had learned a long time ago that discomfort you focus on expands to fill your attention, while discomfort you move through on the way to something else remains for a while at least manageable. He found the attachment point. He hooked the cable. He checked the hook, checked it again, felt along the frame to confirm there was no secondary obstruction he had missed, and then he came back up. He stood in the current water, streaming from his shoulders, and breathed. On the bank, people were moving. He could see Theo Barnett speaking urgently into his radio. He could see one of the construction workers at the water's edge clearly prepared to come in if Walt didn't appear. He could see Lester Vance standing very still watching. Walt raised one hand, not a wave. Just a signal. I'm here. I'm all right. Don't come in. Then he turned and waded back to the bank. The cold followed him out of the water. It was in his hands and his forearms and his face, and the January air, which had seemed merely cold before he entered the river, now felt comparative less cold than the water, which was a form of warmth. He walked steadily. His boots on the frozen mud of the bank made a sound that seemed very loud in the silence that the crew had fallen into. Theo came toward him. What happened? You were under for... I found the problem, Walt said. He kept walking toward the autocar. What problem? What was down there? Old structural steel, wedged under the frame. The crane wasn't just stuck in the mud, it was pinned. I changed the cable angle to account for it. He reached the autocar and put his hand on the cab door. You changed the rigging underwater in film? Yes. Walt climbed up into the cab. Vance had moved closer. His clipboard was at his side. His expression had completed its evolution from professional skepticism into something Walt recognized, the particular look of an intelligent person encountering knowledge that their training hadn't covered and didn't have a category for. Sir, Vance said, and there was something different in the word now than there had been when he'd used it earlier that morning. That old steel, did you determine what it was from? Old bridge work, probably. Pre-war construction. Been in the river long enough to silt over. Your divers either missed it or didn't understand what they were looking at. Vance absorbed this. He looked at the river. He looked back at Walt. If we had pulled with our setup, you would have rotated it, Walt said. Counterweight goes down, boom comes up, whole thing rolls into the channel. You'd have lost it completely. The silence that followed this statement had a different quality than the previous silences. It was the silence of a group of people recalibrating, updating their understanding of the situation, and with it, their understanding of the man sitting in the cab of the 50-year-old truck. Walt engaged the winch. The drum began to turn. It turned slowly with the deep mechanical authority of a system designed for force rather than speed. The gear reduction Henry had calculated on paper in a mill supply room in 1949, converting engine power into cable tension at a rate that moved the drum at approximately walking pace and translated that movement into pulling force, that the cable taut now across 85 feet of frozen Pennsylvania ground communicated to the crane's frame in the river. For 30 seconds, nothing visible happened. This is the part that people who have not done this kind of work misunderstand. They expect the dramatic response, the immediate movement, the obvious result that confirms the force being applied. What actually happens in the first 30 seconds of a recovery pull is invisible to anyone watching from outside. It is the taking up of slack, the seating of cable and block, sheaves the minute repositioning of anchor points as the system comes to full tension, the first communication between the pulling force and the resistance it is addressing. Walt felt it through the truck. He felt it in the way the autocar's frame responded to the load, a subtle stiffening, a change in the quality of the vibration that came through the seat and the steering wheel and the door panel. He had been feeling loads through truck frames his entire working life, and he could read the information in that vibration the way other people read words on a page. The load was enormous. The cable was at or near its working limit, but the anchor points were holding, the blocks were seated correctly, and the angle, the changed angle that accounted for the old I-beam that pulled the crane away from its pin rather than against it was right. He held the tension. He did not increase it. He held it steady for 90 seconds that felt much longer, letting the force work on the connection between the crane's frame and the old structural steel, letting the physics of the situation do what physics does when you apply steady pressure in the right direction rather than maximum force in the wrong one. Then the crane moved. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone watching would have described as movement if they hadn't been looking for exactly this. The counterweight shifted perhaps 3 inches. The surface of the water around the crane's upper structure changed slightly as if the river itself had noticed something. But Walt felt it. He increased the winch speed fractionally, the smallest increment available, and began to pull. The autocar's frame groaned. Not a distress sound. Walt knew the difference between a frame protesting a load it cannot manage and a frame acknowledging a load it is working hard to manage. This was the latter. The sound of honest effort. The crane moved again, 6 inches this time forward and slightly upward as the angle of the cable lifted the front of the frame away from the old I-beam. Walt heard, even over the sound of the engine and the winch, a dull underwater concussion as the I-beam disengaged from its locked position, felt rather than heard a change in the quality of the resistance that came through the cable and registered in the truck's frame as a sudden fractional reduction in load. The pivot was broken. He stopped. Let the winch take up the new slack. The crane had moved forward, perhaps 8 inches total, and the I-beam was no longer pinning it. Now the mud. The mud was a different problem and a different solution. The suction that river mud develops around a large submerged object is not simple friction. It is hydraulic, a pressure differential created by the seal between the mud and the metal. And breaking it requires not just force, but the right kind of force, applied in a way that introduces air or water into the seal. Walt repositioned. He shifted the autocar forward 2 feet on the solid ground of the rise, adjusting the cable angle slightly, and then pulled again. Not straight back, at a slight upward angle that put lifting force on the front of the crane's frame while pulling it forward. The effect was to rock the crane slightly, to work the front edge of the frame up and down against the mud seal in microscopic increments with each pull cycle. Pull, hold, reposition, pull, hold, reposition. The construction crew had stopped talking entirely. Lester Vance had moved to a position 30 feet from the water's edge and was standing with his arms at his sides, clipboard forgotten. He watched each pull cycle with the focused intensity of a man who is trying to learn something and knows that the lesson will not repeat itself. Theo Barnett had his radio at his side. At some point, he had raised it to report something to someone, the insurance company, perhaps, or the company's main office, and then had lowered it without speaking because there was nothing to report yet, and because speaking seemed in the extraordinary silence that had settled over the construction site like a violation of something. The young construction worker, who had been closest to entering the river to check on Walt, was standing at the bank watching. He was 26 years old and had been in construction for 4 years and had never seen a recovery operation before this week. He would tell the story of this morning for the rest of his life, and as the years passed, the story would become more detailed in its particulars and more certain in its conclusions. The way stories do when the people who carry them are trying to preserve something they know mattered. Walt pulled. He had been working for 20 minutes since engaging the winch when he felt the change. It came through the cable first, a different quality of resistance, less uniform, more variable, and as if the load was beginning to develop internal motion rather than presenting as a single static mass. Then it came through the truck's frame, a rhythmic component to the load that had not been there before, the crane beginning to rock on its own as the mud seal weakened. He increased the winch speed. The cable vibrated. The water around the submerged crane's upper structure began to show surface disturbance. Ripples radiating outward that were not the river's current, but the result of movement below. And then the sound. It was not a small sound. It was a sound that several of the people present would later struggle to describe accurately. The closest most of them could come was to compare it to the sound of a very large cork being removed from a very large bottle, amplified to a scale that made the comparison seem inadequate. A deep, wet, concussive release felt as much as heard, the sudden equalization of pressure as the mud seal broke completely, and 4 days of suction surrendered all at once to the steady, patient force that had been working against it. The crane lurched forward. The counterweight broke the surface with a surge of displaced water. The boom released from its 4-foot burial in river mud pivoted upward through the water column, and the whole 80-ton machine, this machine that had been immovable for 4 days, that had defeated a 200-ton hydraulic crane that the insurance adjuster was coming Monday to declare a total loss, began to move. It moved steadily, pulled by a cable connected to a winch on a 50-year-old truck built by a steelworker in his garage in 1948. Walt did not change his pace. He did not accelerate, did not try to take advantage of the momentum by overwhelming the system with speed. He maintained exactly the pace he had been using. Pull, hold, reposition, because the discipline of a recovery operation does not end when the load begins to move. The load moving is when the most critical decisions happen, because a load in motion has different physics than a load at rest, and the difference can be the difference between recovery and secondary disaster. He watched the cable angle. He watched the crane's movement through the water. He made 3 small adjustments to the autocar's position on the rise, tracking the crane's trajectory as it came toward the bank, ensuring the pull angle remained correct for the geometry of the situation as it evolved rather than as it had been when he designed the approach. Vance was watching the cable angle too. Walt noticed this in his peripheral vision, the recovery engineer tracking the same variable, making the same calculation. At some point during the pull, Vance had begun to understand what Walt was doing and why, and that understanding had moved him from the position of an observer to the position of a student. This was not a small thing. Lester Vance had 15 years of heavy recovery experience and 2 university degrees in the particular confidence of a man who has been very good at his job for a long time. For a man like that to recognize that someone else understands something he doesn't and to respond to that recognition with attention rather than defensiveness required a kind of intellectual honesty that is rarer than intelligence. Walt respected it without commenting on it. The crane came through the shallows slowly, its structure dragging through the last of the soft riverbed material before the bank's firmer substrate began. Walt felt the change in load as the crane's weight began to transfer from water to ground, felt it at a reduction in the cable tension as the river stopped being entirely the crane's enemy and became in the shallows something the crane could partially rest on. He adjusted again. The autocar's engine worked steadily, its RPM unchanged from what it had been for the past 30 minutes. The mechanical heartbeat of a system that had been designed for exactly this kind of work and had been maintained for exactly this kind of day. The crane's cab broke the surface, then the upper structure. Then the full weight of the machine was on the riverbank, mud-covered and dripping and damaged in ways that would take weeks to assess and repair, but intact, present, out of the river. Walt shut down the winch. He sat in the cab for a moment with the engine still running and his hands resting on his thighs. Outside the windows, the January morning continued with the complete indifference to human drama that January mornings in Pennsylvania maintain regardless of what humans are doing in them. The river moved past. The low sun cast its flat light across the mud and the water and the recovered crane lying on the bank. Walt set the brake. He climbed down from the cab. He walked to the back of the truck and began to coil the cable. He did this the way he had done everything else that morning, without hurry, without performance, with the focused and methodical attention of a man completing a task that he had begun and that was not finished until the equipment was properly secured. The cable had to be coiled correctly. The blocks had to be recovered and stowed. The rigging had to be broken down in the right sequence so that it could be used again. Lester Vance walked toward him while he was coiling. He stopped a few feet away and watched for a moment. Then he said, "The old I-beam. You identified that by touch underwater in that current." Walt kept coiling. "Yes." "And you changed the attachment point based on that?" "Yes." Vance was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing recovery work for 15 years, he said. "I've never seen that approach used. The compound block system at that distance, combined with the changed force vector to account for a secondary anchor. I've read about it in historical accounts. Pre-hydraulic era industrial recovery, but I've never seen it applied." Walt looked at him then. "My father designed the system for river recoveries in the 1940s. He worked it out from practical experience, not textbooks." "Your father was an engineer." "My father was a steel worker," Walt said. "Steel workers learn engineering from the steel. It's a different kind of education." Vance absorbed this. He looked at the autocar, at the boom at the welds. His trained eye could now assess with some understanding of what they represented. "The block configuration," Vance said. "The gear reduction on the winch, the ratio must be extraordinary. My father calculated it by hand, mill paper pencil slide rule." Walt finished the coil and set it in the truck bed. He said the math was the easy part. The hard part was understanding what you were actually trying to do. Vance nodded slowly. He looked at the recovered crane on the bank, the machine that 4 days and 200 tons of modern recovery capacity had not been able to move. "What were you actually trying to do?" he asked. Not sarcastically, not as a challenge, as a genuine question from a man who wanted to understand. Walt looked at the crane, then at the river, then at the gray January sky above the Pennsylvania hills. "I was trying to convince it to come home," he said. He picked up the next section of cable and began to coil. The crane lay on the riverbank like something that had been away for a long time and had finally come back. It was covered in Allegheny mud, the particular gray-brown mud of a Pennsylvania river bottom, dense and mineral-rich, the kind of mud that doesn't wash off easily and that dries to a crust that has to be chipped rather than brushed. The boom was bent at a point about a third of the way from the tip, where the weight in the mud pressure had exceeded the steel's tolerance during the 4 days of submersion. The cab windows were gone. The hydraulic lines along the left side of the upper structure had been sheared by whatever had caused the original tipping accident, and the hydraulic fluid had long since dispersed into the Allegheny current and traveled downstream toward Pittsburgh. It was damaged. It was going to require months of assessment and repair, and the kind of financial conversation that nobody on the construction site was looking forward to having. But it was on dry land. Walt Greer finished coiling the last section of cable and set it in the autocar's truck bed with the same care he had applied to the first section. He checked the snatch blocks, each one inspected, wiped down with a rag from his jacket pocket, stowed in the wooden crate bolted to the left side of the bed that Henry had built for exactly this purpose in 1950. He checked the winch drum, confirmed the cable was seated correctly, checked the tension on the cable anchor at the drum housing. He did all of this while the construction crew stood on the bank behind him and said nothing. The silence had a different quality now than it had at any other point in the morning. Earlier, the silence had been skeptical, the silence of people withholding comment while they waited for the expected failure. Then it had been tense, the silence of people watching something they didn't understand and weren't sure how to respond to. Now it was something else. It was the silence of people who have witnessed something that exceeded their expectations so completely that the usual social responses, the congratulations, the commentary, the immediate translation of experience into words didn't seem adequate to what had just happened. Theo Barnett was the first to move. He walked toward Walt with the particular walk of a man who has something important to say and is not entirely sure how to say it. He stopped a few feet from the truck bed and watched Walt check the winch for a moment. "Walt," he said. Walt looked up. Theo spread his hands slightly, a gesture that encompassed the crane on the bank, the river, the construction site, the 4 days of failure that had preceded the last 2 hours. "I don't have words for this," he said. Walt nodded once. He understood. He had been in situations before where words were insufficient, and he had learned not to require them. "What do I owe you?" Theo asked. Walt closed the wooden crate and secured the latch. "Nothing." "Walt?" Theo's voice had something in it now that hadn't been there that morning. Not just gratitude, which would have been straightforward, but something more complicated. The sound of a man reconsidering something he thought he understood. "You spent 2 hours in the water. You drove here from Johnstown. The fuel alone—" "I know what the fuel costs," Walt said. He picked up his waders from the truck bed where he had left them after coming out of the river, rolled them carefully, and stowed them in the cab. "I'm not asking to be paid." "Then why—" Walt stopped. He turned and looked at Theo directly in the way he did not often look at people he had just met directly, and with something that wasn't quite openness, but was adjacent to it. The look of a man deciding to say something true instead of something sufficient. "My father built this truck to help people," Walt said. "Steel workers mostly, men who couldn't afford the big recovery companies. He didn't charge much. Sometimes he didn't charge at all. He said the truck was built to help, and that's what it was for, and the day you start using a thing against its purpose is the day you lose the thing." He paused. "I've had this truck for 22 years since he died. I've used it for 11 Barsam. I've charged for 4 of them when the people could pay and insisted on it. The rest were like this." Theo was quiet. "Your crane is out of the river," Walt said. "That's enough." Theo pulled his wallet from his jacket and took out the bills. Walt could see without counting that it was somewhere around $250, $300, whatever Theo had been carrying when he drove to work that morning. He held it out. Walt looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Theo. "Buy your crew lunch," Walt said. "They've had a hard week." He walked to the driver's side of the autocar and climbed in. Theo stood holding the bills, looking at the truck, looking at the boom, looking at the welds that Henry Greer had laid down in a garage in Johnstown in 1948 and 1949 and 1950, the welds that had held the cable system together through 2 hours of pulling 80 tons out of a Pennsylvania river, the welds that showed in their texture and their pattern the specific intelligence of the hands that had made them. Lester Vance appeared beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They both watched Walt start the autocar's engine, the coffin catch and settle into the deep rumble that Walt had been listening to since before he could drive, and begin to turn the truck around on the construction site's access road. "Have you ever seen rigging like that before?" Theo asked. "No," Vance said. He said it without qualification, without the professional hedging that he might have used that morning. "Just no. Clean and honest." "Could you do it? Your equipment, your crew?" Vance thought about it for a moment. "With the right research, probably, but research takes time." He didn't need research. He carried the knowledge. He paused. "That's a different thing." The autocar moved away down the access road at 25 miles per hour, the custom boom swaying slightly with the movement of the truck over the uneven ground, the exhaust rising in a pale column against the January sky. They watched it go. The Allegheny River continued moving past the construction site, dark and steady and entirely indifferent, carrying the winter downstream toward Pittsburgh, the way it had been carrying winters downstream since long before anyone had built anything on its banks. The recovered crane dripped Allegheny mud onto the Allegheny bank. The construction crew began slowly and without announcement to return to work. Walt drove back to Johnstown the same way he had come, at the same speed on the same roads. The morning had moved past 11 o'clock, and the January sun was at its highest winter angle, which was not very high, and the Pennsylvania countryside moved past the autocar's flat windshield with the particular quality of winter landscape, everything stripped to its essential structure, the trees bare, the fields brown and frost-hardened, the hills showing their bones. He was cold. The waders had kept most of the river water off his skin, but the air temperature had been working on him since he entered the water that morning, and the autocar's cab heater, a system that Henry had retrofitted in 1952, and that Walt had repaired 3 times since, produced warmth in the enthusiastic but imprecise manner of vintage heating systems. It took the edge off. It did not eliminate the cold. Walt did not mind this particularly. He had spent 42 years working in conditions that ranged from uncomfortably cold to genuinely dangerous. And he had developed the working man's relationship with physical discomfort, which is not the absence of feeling it, but the ability to set it aside as irrelevant to the task at hand. The task at hand was driving. He drove. He thought about the river. He thought about the moment when the crane's boom had broken free of the mud, the sound of it, the change in the cable tension that he had felt through the truck's frame before anyone on the bank could see what was happening. He thought about the old structural I-beam that had been wedged under the crane's frame, invisible from the surface, the piece of pre-war construction that had been sleeping in the Allegheny riverbed long enough to become part of the riverbed's ecology. He thought about what would have happened if the recovery team had managed to apply their crane's rated capacity to the cable as planned, the rotation, the roll, the crane going deeper. He thought about Lester Vance. Vance had come up beside him one more time before Walt drove away from the construction site while Walt was doing his final check of the cable stowage. He hadn't said much. He had said, "I want to understand the block configuration better, the compound system your father designed. Is there documentation anywhere, drawings, calculations?" Walt had thought about it. There were papers. In a wooden box in the garage under the workbench, the mill paper, his father had done his calculations on the pencil drawings of the block system, the gear ratio calculations for the winch. Henry had kept them, and Walt had kept them because Henry had kept them, which was the way things got preserved in families like his, not through intention, but through the simple habit of not discarding what the previous generation had valued. He had told Vance he would think about it. He was still thinking about it when he reached the outskirts of Johnstown and the roads became familiar, and the autocar found its way home, the way old vehicles find their way through the accumulated habit of many returns. The garage was the same as he had left it. The workbench, the tools on their pegs, the wooden crate under the bench, the scanner on the shelf. The canvas tarp folded in the corner where he had left it when he pulled it off the autocar at 5 o'clock that morning, 6 hours and a lifetime ago. Walt backed the truck into the garage and shut off the engine. The rumble died and the garage became quiet with the particular silence of an enclosed space where a large engine has just stopped, a silence that has texture that is defined by the contrast with what came before it. He sat in the cab for a moment. He was 73 years old and he had spent 2 hours in 34-degree water and 4 hours behind the wheel of a truck that did not have power steering, and his body was registering all of this in the comprehensive and specific way that bodies register the requests they've been asked to fulfill. His hands ached. His lower back had opinions. The cold had settled into the muscles of his forearms and shoulders in a way that he knew from experience would take the better part of a day to fully release. He climbed down from the cab carefully the way he did most physical things now. Not slowly, but with the deliberate attention of a man who has learned to cooperate with what his body requires rather than ignore it until it stops cooperating entirely. He walked around the truck, checked the cable one more time. He had checked it at the construction site, but he checked it again here because here was where the truck lived and here was where the final accounting of any job happened. Everything was in order. The rigging was stowed, the blocks were secure, the winch drum was properly seated. He pulled the canvas tarp over the truck. He went inside. The house on Maple Street was a 2-story frame house that Walt had grown up in, and that he and Eleanor had moved back into when his mother died in 1978 because the house needed someone in it and they were the right people to be there. It had the particular quality of a house that had been lived in fully and carefully for a long time, not pristine, not neglected, but shaped by the people who had occupied it, marked in small ways by decades of ordinary life. Walt made coffee. He stood at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed and looked out the window at the backyard, at the bare trees and the frost-hardened ground and the gray January sky above the roofline of the house behind his. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was doing what he often did in the hours after a job, letting the morning settle, letting the details arrange themselves in his mind from the disordered sequence of experience into the more coherent sequence of memory. The coffee was ready. He poured a cup and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The house was very quiet. It was always quiet now, had been quiet since Eleanor died in the spring of 1993. Walt had lived with that quiet for almost 5 years, long enough that it had stopped being a presence and become simply a condition, the baseline of his daily life, the way the sound of the mill had been the baseline of his working life. You stopped hearing what you heard every day. It became the ground against which other things stood out. He drank his coffee. He thought about Eleanor, which he did most days, usually in the morning. Not with the acute grief of the early years that had softened the way grief softens with time without disappearing, the way a scar softens without ceasing to be a scar. He thought about her the way you think about someone who is woven into the fabric of everything you are so thoroughly that separating what you became from what she contributed to your becoming is not possible and not particularly useful to attempt. She would have asked about the job. She would have sat across from him at this table with her own coffee and asked the specific practical questions that she had always asked, not the large questions about meaning or significance, but the details. How was the ground? Did the block seat correctly? What did the current do when you changed the cable angle? She had learned over 40 years of marriage to a man who moved heavy things for a living to ask about the specifics because the specifics were where Walt lived. And conversation that stayed at the level of abstraction was conversation that excluded him. He missed her in the specific way that he missed everything he had lost. Not as an absence of something general, but as the absence of something exact. The specific weight and quality of her presence at this table on this morning, asking those questions. The phone rang at 7:15 in the evening. Walt had spent the afternoon the way he spent most afternoons, sometime in the garage, checking the truck's fluid levels, which he had run harder that morning than he had in years. Then sometime at the workbench, sorting through a box of fittings he had been meaning to sort for several months. He had eaten dinner at 5:30, a habit from the mill years that he had never broken. He was sitting in the living room with a book when the phone rang. He answered it on the third ring. Dad. Marcus. Walt had not spoken to his son in 6 weeks since the conversation about the truck that had ended without resolution and without Walt calling back. Marcus, Walt said. There was a pause on the line. Not an uncomfortable pause, something different. The pause of a person organizing themselves before saying something that matters. Someone posted a video online, Marcus said, from the construction site today, on the Allegheny River. Walt said nothing. I saw it about an hour ago. Someone I work with sent it to me. He didn't know it was you, he just sent it because of the truck. He collects vintage equipment, sends me stuff sometimes. Another pause. I watched it 3 times. Walt looked at the wall across from his chair. There was a photograph there, himself and Eleanor, at the Cambria County Fair. In 1971, and Eleanor laughing at something Walt had apparently said. Walt looking at her with the expression that he had in photographs of that period, which was the expression of a man who is aware that he is fortunate and is slightly uncomfortable with how clearly that awareness shows. Dad. Marcus's voice had something in it that Walt had not heard before, or perhaps had not heard in a very long time. The particular quality of a person encountering something that reorders their understanding. I watched you rig that system. I watched you go into the water. I watched the crane come out. Walt waited. I think I finally understand why you kept it, Marcus said. The words were simple. They were the kind of simple that takes a long time to arrive at, not the simplicity of a thought that was always clear, but the simplicity of a thought that has been complicated and has finally come through the other side of its complexity into a clarity that can be stated plainly. Walt sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the photograph on the wall. He thought about Henry. He thought about the garage on Maple Street in 1948, his father buying a chassis for $800, saved over 3 years of extra shifts. He thought about the welds on the boom, the specific weld geometry that his father had chosen for strength at the critical load points, the geometry that Walt had inspected that afternoon, and found intact as sound as they had been when Henry laid them down. He thought about everything he had tried to tell Marcus over the years, not in long conversations, because he was not a man of long conversations, but in the specific practical statements that were how he communicated the small things he had said on the occasions when the truck came up trying to explain something that he could not quite reach the right words for. He thought about Eleanor, who had understood all of it and had spent 40 years serving as the patient interpreter between Walt's way of knowing things and the ways that other people could receive them. He felt something move in his chest. Walt Greer was not a man who cried. He had cried twice as an adult in his own memory once, When his father died in 1976, standing in the garage with his hand on the autocar's fender, and once when Eleanor died in the spring of 1993, in the hospital room after it was over, sitting in the chair beside the bed that was no longer occupied. He was not a man who apologized for crying on those occasions either. He simply noted that they had happened and that the circumstances had warranted it. The circumstances now were different from either of those. No one had died. Nothing had been lost. Something had in fact been found, something that Walt had spent years trying to communicate and had been unable to communicate in the way it needed to be communicated, and that a video taken by a stranger on a construction site had communicated instead. His eyes were wet. He sat in the living room of the house on Maple Street in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, on a January evening in 1998, with the phone in his hand and the photograph on the wall, and the garage behind the house with the auto car under its canvas tarp, and the smell of motor oil and cold concrete. That was the smell of his father's work and his own work, and the work that the truck had been built to do. "I'm glad you understand," he said. His voice was level, but only barely. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then, "Tell me about it. The job today. Tell me what you did." And Walt Greer, who was not a man of long conversations, who had spent 73 years communicating in the short functional bursts that mill work in working life had shaped him, told his son about the morning. He told him about the scanner and the drive north and the ground along the Allegheny bank. He told him about finding the solid earth on the rise 85 feet from the water. He told him about the old structural I-beam under the crane's frame. He told him about the water temperature and the current and the 4 minutes he had spent underwater changing the cable attachment point. He told him about Henry, about the calculations on mill paper, about the principle that Henry had articulated so many times that Walt could no longer find its origin. Don't fight the weight. Talk to it. Find where the ground remembers being solid. He talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than he had talked on the phone in years. Possibly longer than he had talked on the phone since Eleanor died. Marcus listened. He asked questions, not the large questions, but the specific ones, the practical ones, the questions about the block configuration and the cable angle and how Walt had known where the solid ground was, the questions that Eleanor would have asked. Walt answered them. When they finished talking, Marcus said, "I'll be home for Easter if that's all right." "It's your home," Walt said. After he hung up, he sat in the living room for a long time. The house was quiet around him, but it was a different quiet than it had been that morning. Not heavier or lighter, just different. The quiet of a house where something has shifted, where the air has changed slightly, the way air changes when a window has been opened and then closed, carrying something in from outside that was not there before. Walt stood up, put on his jacket, and went out to the garage. He stood beside the autocar under its canvas tarp and put his hand on the truck's hood. The metal was cold from the January night. He could feel the shape of the engine beneath it, the block, the heads, the mechanical geography of a machine he had known since before he could drive. He stood there for a while. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was doing what he had done twice a year for 22 years, being in the presence of the thing his father had built, in the place where his father had built it, feeling the particular quality of a life that had been lived with purpose and passed on with intention. He thought about what Lester Vance had asked him at the end before he drove away, about the papers, the calculations on mill paper, the drawings of the block system in his father's handwriting, the pencil lines precise and clear in the way that Henry's work was always precise and clear, the annotations in the margins, explaining the reasoning behind each design decision, as if Henry had known even then that someone would need to understand not just what had been built, but why. Walt made a decision. He would get the box from under the workbench. He would go through the papers. He would call Lester Vance. Theo Barnett would have his number, and he would arrange to make them available. Not as a gift, not as a transaction, as a record. Because the knowledge that Henry Greer had developed in the practice of actual work on actual rivers in actual Pennsylvania winters was real knowledge, valuable knowledge, the kind of knowledge that disappeared when the people who held it died, and that could be preserved if someone made the effort to preserve it. Henry had made the effort to write it down. Walt had kept it because Henry had kept it. Now it was time to do something more intentional with it than keeping. He stood with his hand on the truck's hood for another moment. Then he went inside. In the years that followed, Walt Greer was called out 11 more times. The jobs came the way the Allegheny River job had come through the scanner, through word of mouth, through the network of construction and recovery professionals who began after January of 1998 to pass his name along in the particular way that the name of a last resort gets passed along. Not advertised, not publicized, spoken quietly from one person to another in the conversations that happen on construction sites and in equipment yards when someone mentions a situation that doesn't have an obvious solution. A cement truck that had broken through the ice on a quarry pond in Fayette County in February of 1999. A bulldozer stuck in a strip mine in Greene County where the overburden had made it impossible to position conventional recovery equipment. A semi-trailer that had gone down an embankment on Route 30 in the winter of 2001 in conditions where the ground wouldn't hold anything heavy enough to recover it conventionally. Each time the Autocar did what the modern equipment couldn't. Not because it was superior to modern equipment in any general sense. It was not. It was slower, simpler, and limited in the scale of work it could address. But in the specific situations where it was called, it had advantages that modern equipment did not. It was lighter on soft ground. Its boom was tall enough to work from solid earth at distances that conventional recovery cranes could not reach. And it was operated by a man whose knowledge of the specific problems those situations presented had been accumulated over decades of actual work. Walt never advertised. He charged when people could pay and insisted. He didn't charge when they couldn't or when the situation seemed to him like the kind of situation his father would not have charged for. There was no formula for this distinction. It was judgment, the exercise of the same faculty that told him where the ground was solid and how the cable wanted to run the accumulated intelligence of a life spent paying attention to things that mattered. Marcus came home for Easter in 1998, as he had said he would. He spent 4 days in the house on Maple Street. On the second day, he spent 3 hours in the garage with Walt going through the wooden box under the workbench, the mill paper, the calculations, the drawings. Marcus had his father's aptitude for spatial reasoning. It turned out, though, it had been directed into software rather than steel, and he understood the block system and the gear reduction calculations more quickly than Walt had expected. They did not talk about the phone call or about what Marcus had said. That was not how Walt communicated, and Marcus had spent enough years in his father's orbit to understand this. They talked about the drawings. They talked about Henry. They talked about what it had been like to work in the mills in the 1950s and 1960s, and Walt told stories he had not told in years. The stories that live in the specific memory of physical work, the smell of the blast furnaces, the sound, the cranes made in the cold, the particular quality of steel in different stages of its making. Marcus listened. He asked the specific questions. Walt answered them. After Easter, Marcus started calling more regularly. Not every week. He was a busy man with his own life and his own work and his own obligations. But more regularly, and when he called, he asked about the truck. He asked about the barn. He asked sometimes about Henry. Walt appreciated this in the way that he appreciated most things without effusion, without declaration. He appreciated it by being present in the conversations, by answering the questions fully, by not being brief in the way he had sometimes been brief when brevity was a way of keeping distance. Walt Greer died on a Wednesday morning in March of 2004 in the house on Maple Street in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. He was 79 years old. The cause was cardiac. His heart, which had worked as steadily and as hard as any piece of machinery he had ever operated, simply completed its operational life. Marcus drove from Pittsburgh, where he had relocated from Seattle 2 years earlier, partly for professional reasons and partly for reasons he did not fully articulate. But that had something to do with the conversations he had been having with his father, with the sense that proximity to a person's remaining years is something you cannot recover once you've foregone it. He handled the arrangements with the same quality of attention that Walt had applied to everything methodically, completely, without cutting corners on the things that mattered. He kept the house, he kept the tools, he kept the truck. For 14 months, the Autocar sat in the garage under its canvas tarp, with the engine started twice a year in May and in January, because some obligations don't expire just because the world has moved on. In May of 2005, Marcus Greer donated the Autocar DC 100 to the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The site where the Bethlehem Steel Works had stood on the bank of the Monongahela River, the place where the steel industry of western Pennsylvania had been born and had flourished, and had ended, the place where the specific kind of knowledge that Henry Greer and Walt Greer had possessed had been forged in the literal heat of actual work. The museum's conservators spent 8 months on the restoration. They did not restore it to showroom condition. They restored it to working condition, because a machine built for work is honored by being preserved as a working machine rather than as an aesthetic object. The welds on the boom were cleaned and inspected and found sound. The winch drum was rebuilt with period-appropriate components. The engine was overhauled by a mechanic who specialized in pre-war American commercial vehicles, and who said when he had finished that he had never seen an engine of that age in that condition, which was a testament to the quality of Walt's maintenance over 22 years of twice-annual starts. The placard beside the truck in the Made in Steel exhibit reads, Autocar DC 1948, built by Henry Greer, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 1948 to 1950, used by his son Walt Greer, 1976 to 2004, because that is what it was built for. The recovery crane that couldn't do the job in January of 1998 is still in service. It works on solid ground, which is where it was designed to work, and it does excellent work there. It has recovered hundreds of pieces of equipment in the years since the Allegheny River job, and the people who operate it are good at what they do. There is nothing wrong with this. There is nothing wrong with any of it, not with the engineers and their calculations, not with the hydraulic systems and the rated capacities and the specifications that define what modern equipment can and cannot do. These are legitimate things. They represent genuine knowledge, genuine capability, genuine value. But in the construction yards and equipment operations around Pittsburgh, when someone describes a recovery situation that doesn't have an obvious solution, when the ground is too soft and the load is too far from solid earth, and the conventional approach doesn't reach, someone tells the story. Not the story of the equipment, the story of the man. The man who drove north on a January morning without being asked, who read the ground with his hands the way his father had taught him to read it, who went alone into 34-degree water and found the problem that nobody else had found and fixed it underwater with his hands and came out without saying much about it, who pulled 80 tons with a truck that weighed 10, not by overpowering the situation but by understanding it, who was offered money and declined, who drove home at 25 miles per hour with the heater working on the cold that had gotten into his bones thinking about his father. The Autocar DC-100 stands in the Rivers of Steel Museum in Homestead, Pennsylvania, on the bank of the Monongahela River, 40 miles from the Allegheny, where it did its last and most remembered work. People walk past it. Some of them stop. Some of them read the placard. Some of them look at the boom, at the welds, at the I-beam construction, at the homemade quality of it. That is also, if you look carefully, the quality of something made with complete understanding of what it needed to do. Occasionally, someone who knows a story tells it to someone who is standing there looking at the truck. They tell it the way Walt told Marcus about the morning on the Allegheny, not starting with the big moments, but starting with the specific details. The ground, the rise 85 feet from the water, the solid earth 8 inches down where the frost had gone all the way through, the old structural I-beam that nobody else had found, the cable angle, the sound when the mud let go. And then the other part, the part that is not about equipment or physics or mechanical advantage. The phone ringing in the house on Maple Street at 7:15 in the evening. The son in Pittsburgh who had watched a video 3 times. The 40 minutes on the phone that was longer than Walt had talked on the phone in years. The garage in the January night, the hand on the cold hood of the truck, the canvas tarp folded in the corner. The things that get built by working men in their garages, and the things that get built in the years that follow, the understanding between a father and a son that takes a long time to arrive, and arrives sometimes in ways nobody planned. That is what the truck was built for. That is what it did.